He walked into that boardroom like he owned it. Because he thought he did. 41 years. That's how long Terrence Wade had been sitting at the head of that table. 41 years of cutting deals, firing people before their coffee got cold, and building Crestline Capital into one of the most recognized private equity firms in the Southeast. He had a plaque on the wall that said as much. He had a portrait in the lobby, oil on canvas, commissioned, framed in mahogany, that said the rest. So when the door opened that Tuesday morning and a woman he'd never seen before walked into his conference room and sat down 2 seats from the head of the table, Terrence Wade didn't ask her name. He told her to leave. "Excuse me." He didn't look up from his folder. "This is a closed session." The woman didn't move. She was maybe 35, dark-skinned, natural hair pulled back neatly, wearing a charcoal blazer over a white blouse. No jewelry except small gold earrings. She had a leather portfolio in front of her, and a cup of coffee she'd brought herself. She looked like she'd been sitting in that chair her whole life. "I'm aware," she said. That made him look up. "Then you know you're in the wrong room." "I don't think I am." Terrence Wade set down his pen. He glanced around at the other men already seated. CFO, his general counsel, 2 board members who'd flown in from Atlanta. He gave them the look that said somebody handle this. Nobody moved. "Ma'am." He leaned back. "I don't know who let you in, but this meeting is for Crestline leadership only. So if you'd kindly." "Vivian Osei-Mensah," she said. "Chief Investment Officer, Beaumont Group." Silence. "We own 43% of Crestline Capital." She opened her portfolio. "As of last Thursday." If you've ever watched someone's face go through 5 emotions in 3 seconds, then you know exactly what happened to Terrence Wade right then. First came confusion. Then disbelief. Then the particular kind of anger that only comes to men who've never once been told no by someone they didn't respect first. He laughed, not a small laugh. A full, shoulder-dropping, hand-waving laugh. The kind that's supposed to make the other person feel foolish for even speaking. "Beaumont Group," he repeated, like it was a punchline. "Right." One of the Atlanta board members, a man named Douglas Ferris who had known Terrence for 20 years, shifted in his seat. Terrence didn't notice. Or he didn't care. "See, I've been running this firm since before you were probably in high school. I know every name on our cap table, and I know every executive at Beaumont, and I have never," he actually pointed across the table, "seen you before in my life." "That's because we've only spoken by phone," Vivian said. "My name was in the acquisition documents your legal team received on April 14th. I followed up in writing on April 22nd and again on May 3rd. Another beat of silence. "The documents your team signed, Mr. Wade." He stopped laughing. Here's what you need to understand about Terrence Wade. He hadn't read those documents. Not personally. He'd handed them to his legal team, told them to summarize the key terms, skimmed 2 pages over dinner, and signed where they told him to sign. He'd done it 100 times over 40 years. That was how men like Terrence operated. They delegated the details and kept their eyes on the big picture. The big picture right now was a problem. Because Beaumont Group wasn't a rumor. It wasn't some shell company or speculative fund. It was one of the most quietly powerful black-owned investment firms in the country. Founded in 1987 by a man named Augustus Beaumont, who'd built his fortune in infrastructure and telecommunications before most people had a cell phone. Beaumont himself had passed away 3 years ago. But the firm hadn't slowed down. If anything, it had accelerated. Vivian Osei-Mensah had joined as a junior analyst straight out of Howard University 17 years ago. She'd worked every position in that firm. She'd closed deals in Lagos, London, and Louisville. She'd restructured 2 failing companies and turned them profitable within 18 months each time. When Augustus Beaumont's son, Marcus Jr., took over as CEO, his first call was to Vivian to make her CIO. She hadn't walked into Crestline Capital that morning looking for a fight. She'd walked in because this was her meeting, in a building her firm now had a controlling interest in, and she had work to do. Terrence Wade just hadn't gotten the memo. Well, he had. He simply hadn't read it. "I'd like to get started," Vivian said. She turned to Douglas Ferris, who at least had the decency to look embarrassed. "Mr. Ferris, I believe you have the Q1 portfolio review." Ferris opened his folder. Terrence slammed his hand on the table. Not a fist, just a flat palm, like a period at the end of a sentence. Nobody is getting started with anything. He stood up. I don't care what your name is or what firm you say you work for. You will not walk into this room and conduct a meeting like you have authority here. That is not how this works. Vivian looked at him for a long moment. Mr. Wade, she said, calm as still water. You may want to call your general counsel before you say anything else. My general counsel is sitting right there. He gestured at a heavyset man in a blue suit at the end of the table. Leonard Chu, who'd been Crestline's attorney for 12 years, and who was, at that exact moment, staring at the ceiling like he was praying for a fire drill. Leonard, Terrence's voice dropped. Tell her. Leonard Chu exhaled through his nose. Terrence, tell her. The acquisition closed on April 28th. Leonard's voice was barely above a whisper. The documents were valid. I told you in the summary that Beaumont was taking a 43% stake. We went over this. The room went very quiet. Terrence Wade turned to look at Leonard Chu with the expression of a man who has just realized the floor beneath him isn't floor at all. You told me it was a minority position, he said slowly. 43% is not majority, Leonard said. Technically. But combined with the 2 board seats they were assigned in the operating agreement, what 2 board seats? Another silence. Longer this time. Terrence. Leonard set down his pen. I sent you 47 pages. I highlighted the relevant sections. I sent a follow-up email with bullet points. I called you on a Tuesday morning and you told me, and I'm going to quote you directly, that you'd deal with it later. If you've ever seen a man try to hold himself together in a room full of people who are all watching him fail to hold himself together, then you know what the next 30 seconds looked like. Terrence Wade sat back down. Slowly, Vivian Osei-Mensah picked up her pen and turned to Douglas Ferris. The Q1 review, she said again, whenever you're ready. Now if this story ended there, it would already be something. But it didn't end there. Not even close. What happened next is the part people need to understand. Because what Terrence Wade did in the weeks that followed tells you more about a certain kind of man than anything that happened in that boardroom. He didn't accept it. He went home that night and called 3 people. His personal attorney, a private investigator he'd used once before for a competitor dispute, and his oldest friend on the Crestline board, a man named Howard Pruitt, who'd been with him since the early days. He told Howard that something had gone wrong, that there was a woman claiming to represent Beaumont, that he needed to understand exactly how this had happened and how to unwind it. Howard called him back the next morning with 2 pieces of news. The first, the acquisition was clean, legal, binding, properly executed. There was nothing to unwind. The second, Howard had done his own research on Vivian Osei-Mensah overnight. He'd found an interview she'd given to Black Enterprise 2 years prior, a profile in Forbes, a commencement speech she'd delivered at Spelman, and a photograph taken at an industry conference in 2022 in which she was standing next to Leonard Chu and smiling. They'd met before. Terrence, Howard said. Leonard knew who she was. That's the part that broke something open, because it meant that when Terrence had laughed at her, when he'd pointed across the table, when he'd talked to her like she'd wandered in off the street, Leonard Chu had been sitting right there, knowing exactly who she was and what she represented, and he had said nothing. Not a word to prepare him. Not a whisper before the meeting. Nothing. Some people, when they hear this, say Leonard was being unprofessional, maybe even cowardly, and maybe that's true. But here's the other way to look at it. Leonard had sent 47 pages. He'd highlighted the sections. He'd sent bullet points. He'd made a phone call. Terrence Wade had said he'd deal with it later. There's a version of this story where Leonard Chu is the villain. But honestly, and think about this carefully, there's another version where he's just a man who finally stopped protecting someone from the consequences of their own arrogance. Terrence chose not to read the documents. Terrence chose not to prepare for a meeting in his own firm. Terrence chose, in that boardroom, to point at a woman he'd never bothered to learn anything about and laugh at her like she was nobody. Every single thing that happened after that, he built it himself, brick by brick, for 41 years. Vivian, for her part, did not gloat. That's worth saying, because it would have been easy to. She had every reason. She'd walked into a room and been treated like an intruder in a building her firm had just paid 9 figures to be part of. She'd been laughed at by a man who didn't know her name and hadn't cared to learn it. But when she went back to Beaumont's offices that evening, and her assistant asked how the meeting went, she just said, "We got through the Q1 numbers. Schedule the operational review for next week." That was it. Her assistant, a young woman named Camille, 24 years old, first job out of college, looked up from her desk. Was it bad? Vivian set her portfolio down. She thought about it for a moment. It was familiar, she said. She'd grown up in a place called Millburn, Georgia. Not the town, the community outside the town. The part that didn't appear on tourism brochures. Her father, Vivian Osei-Mensah, drove a bus for the county school district for 31 years. Her mother, Cassandra, worked at a dry cleaner 5 days a week and sang in the church choir on Sundays. They had a small house with a garden in the back and a bookshelf in the living room. That was the most important piece of furniture they owned. Vivian had been the kind of child who read every book on that shelf twice. She'd gotten a full scholarship to Howard. She'd graduated summa cum laude. She'd walked into Beaumont Group at 22 years old with a leather folder that was almost as big as she was, and a handshake that her father had made her practice every Sunday after church since she was 12 years old. "You're going to walk into rooms," he'd told her once, "where people look at you and decide before you open your mouth. Your job isn't to change their minds right away. Your job is to be so prepared that by the time they figure out they were wrong, it's too late for it to matter." She'd written that down in a notebook. She still had the notebook. The operational review the following week did not go well for Terrence Wade. Vivian and her team had spent 5 days inside Crestline's financials. What they found wasn't fraud. It wasn't anything criminal. It was something almost worse. Years of comfortable mediocrity. Returns that looked reasonable on the surface, but when benchmarked against comparable firms, were consistently middle of the pack. A fee structure that favored the house. A personnel roster with almost no diversity above the director level. 3 portfolio companies that had been underperforming for over 2 years with no restructuring plan in sight. Beaumont Group hadn't bought into Crestline because they thought it was thriving. They'd bought in because they believed the underlying assets had value that wasn't being realized. Value that was being left on the table by leadership that had been in place too long and had stopped asking hard questions. Vivian walked Terrence through the analysis herself. She didn't send a proxy. She didn't have a junior associate present while she sat in the back. She sat across from him and went slide by slide. Terrence Wade was quiet throughout. He asked a few questions, some defensive, some genuine. At one point, he pushed back on a comparison she'd made to a competing firm, and she answered him with 3 minutes of detail that shut the objection down completely. At the end of the presentation, he sat back and looked at the last slide for a long time. "This is your recommendation?" he said finally. "It's the board's agenda for the next 6 months. Yes, you're going to restructure the Winston Group position. We're going to exit it. The timeline is in the appendix." He was quiet again. "That deal was mine," he said. Not angry, just said it. "I know," Vivian said. "That's in the file too." What happened over the next 3 months isn't a story about punishment. People like to frame it that way. They like the idea of a villain getting what he deserves in one dramatic moment. Lights out, curtain down. But that's not how it actually works. Real consequences arrive slowly. They accumulate. Terrence Wade wasn't fired in that boardroom. He wasn't fired the week of the operational review either. The board, including Howard Pruitt, who'd been his friend for 20 years, voted to restructure executive leadership as part of the turnaround plan. The vote was 5-2. Terrence voted no. So did one other holdout who resigned the following week. His departure was announced internally as a transition to senior advisory capacity. The press release used the word honored twice. He had 3 weeks to clear his office. His portrait stayed in the lobby for exactly 19 more days. Then it came down and was replaced with a framed copy of Crestline's original founding charter, which had been sitting in a box in the archive room for decades. The managing director who oversaw the swap told his assistant it felt like opening a window. The woman who got the most attention, in the weeks after all of this became known. Because in the world of private equity, nothing stays quiet for long, wasn't Vivian. It was a woman named Paulette Greer. Paulette had been an associate at Crestline for 9 years. She'd interviewed 6 times for the director-level promotion she'd been, in her words, gently redirected from each time. She was 43 years old, had an MBA from Wharton, and had quietly generated more actionable deal flow than anyone else at her level for the past 4 years. After Beaumont Group took its board seats and the new management structure was announced, Paulette was promoted to Director of Portfolio Strategy. She didn't get a press release. She got an email. She printed it out and put it in a frame she'd already bought. She'd bought the frame 2 years earlier. She told her sister that night, "I just needed to be ready for when the room finally made sense." Terrence Wade moved to Hilton Head. He told people he was consulting independently. He had a lunch with a former business partner in November that didn't lead anywhere. He played golf 3 times a week. His name came up once more in the industry press. A short item about a lawsuit he'd briefly contemplated against Beaumont Group that his own attorney had talked him out of, apparently within the first 30-minute phone call. "There's nothing to sue over," his attorney had reportedly told him. "You signed the documents. You didn't read them. That's not a lawsuit. That's a lesson." Terrence had apparently not appreciated the phrasing. Vivian spoke at an industry dinner in the spring. She didn't mention Terrence Wade by name. She didn't talk about Crestline. She talked about preparation. About what it meant to walk into a room knowing something that the room didn't know yet. About the patience it took to sit still while someone laughed at you because you understood something they didn't. That the laugh was already the beginning of the end for them. A young woman in the audience, maybe 25, sitting in the 3rd row, the only person of color at her table, took out her phone and typed a note to herself. She didn't share it with anyone. She just typed it and kept it. But if you could read it, it would say almost exactly what Vivian Osei-Mensah had told his daughter in that small house in Milburn, Georgia, more years ago than either of them could fully account for. Be so prepared that by the time they figure out they were wrong, it's too late for it to matter. There are rooms all over this country right now where this same thing is playing out. Different names, different industries, different floors of different buildings. Someone is being laughed at. Someone is being pointed at. Someone is being told, in language that may be polite or may not be polite at all, that they don't belong. And somewhere in that same room, or in the next room, or in the next building, there is a folder, a portfolio, a file, a set of documents, 47 pages, or 400, or 4. Signed, dated, and binding. The people doing the laughing almost never read the documents. The people they're laughing at almost always do. That's not a coincidence. That's not luck. That's what happens when you spend your whole life knowing that the room might not open the door for you, so you learn to build your own doors and your own rooms, and eventually, quietly, legally, on the record, the buildings themselves. Terrence Wade sat in his office for 41 years and thought the building was his because his name was on the door. Vivian Osei-Mensah knew something he didn't. Names come off doors all the time. What lasts is what's in the documents.